The shortwave receiver crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. on March 14, 1963, in a suburban basement in Bethesda, Maryland. 17-year-old David Rothman, hunched over his home-built transceiver rig, was logging routine amateur radio contacts when he intercepted something that made his hand freeze over the frequency dial. Through the static, a voice speaking accented English was transmitting what sounded like a series of 5-digit number groups, methodical and unhurried, on a frequency that should have been empty. The transmission lasted 93 seconds. When it ended, Rothman sat in silence, staring at the penciled notation in his logbook, uncertain whether he had just stumbled into something extraordinary or merely caught atmospheric skip from a foreign military exercise. What he did not know was that his decision in the next 20 minutes would set in motion an FBI counterintelligence operation that would expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil during the height of the Cold War, unravel the career of a mid-level State Department translator, and reveal how close the United States had come to losing control of classified diplomatic communications for nearly 18 months. To understand how a teenager's curiosity became a national security incident, you have to understand the peculiar intersection of Cold War paranoia and the amateur radio culture that flourished in post-war America. By 1963, ham radio had become a mass hobby, with over 200,000 licensed operators in the United States alone. These operators, mostly male and ranging from high school students to retirees, built their own equipment, chased distant contacts across continents, and occupied a unique position in the communications landscape. They were technically sophisticated, legally authorized to transmit on specific frequencies, and largely self-regulating. The Federal Communications Commission monitored compliance, but the sheer volume of transmissions and the transient nature of shortwave propagation meant that most of what happened on the amateur bands went unrecorded. For intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain, this created both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that amateur operators occasionally stumbled onto military or espionage communications. The opportunity was that the same crowded, chaotic spectrum could be used to hide clandestine transmissions in plain sight, relying on the assumption that most listeners would dismiss anomalies as foreign broadcasters, propagation quirks, or equipment malfunctions. David Rothman was not a typical teenager. The son of a mechanical engineer and a high school mathematics teacher, he had been building radio equipment since age 12, soldering circuits on his bedroom floor and stringing antennas across the backyard over his parents' objections. By 17, he held a general class amateur license, call sign W3QZT, and operated a station that rivaled those of adult hobbyists twice his age. His logbook was meticulous. He recorded not just call signs and signal reports, but also frequency, time, propagation conditions, and any anomalies. It was this habit of precision that made the March 14th intercept significant. Rothman knew the frequency he had been monitoring, 7.085 MHz, fell within the 40-meter amateur band, a segment heavily used for voice contacts in the evening. The transmission he heard was not amateur traffic. It was not a broadcast station. It was a series of number groups transmitted in a flat, emotionless cadence, with no identification, no call sign, no preamble. Rothman had read enough about Cold War espionage in magazines and paperback thrillers to recognize the profile of a numbers station, the shortwave phenomenon used by intelligence agencies to communicate with agents in the field using one-time pads. He made a decision that many in his position would not have made. He called the FBI. At 12:03 a.m., he dialed the Washington Field Office emergency line, a number he had found in the phone book, and reported what he had heard. The night duty officer, Special Agent Kenneth Harmon, took the call with skepticism. The Bureau received dozens of crank calls each week from amateur radio operators claiming to have intercepted Soviet spy transmissions, and nearly all of them turned out to be misidentified foreign broadcasters or atmospheric anomalies. But Harman followed protocol. He took Rothman's name, address, and a detailed description of the transmission, including the exact frequency, time, and the first 10 number groups Rothman had managed to transcribe before the signal faded. Harman told Rothman someone would follow up and advised him not to discuss the intercept with anyone. Then Harman filed a contact report and went back to his paperwork, expecting nothing to come of it. What Harman did not know was that the FBI's Counterintelligence Division had been running a low-priority investigation into suspected Soviet communications activity in the mid-Atlantic region for nearly 8 months. The investigation, codenamed Red Wave, had been triggered by a defector's vague claim that the KGB had established a numbers station capability somewhere on the East Coast, possibly using a mobile transmitter to avoid triangulation. The defector had provided no specifics, no frequencies, no schedule. The FBI had monitored known espionage frequencies intermittently, but had found nothing. Red Wave was on the verge of being closed due to lack of evidence. Rothman's call, logged into the system at 12:11 a.m., pinged an alert in the Red Wave case file because the frequency he reported, 7.0 MHz, matched one of the hypothetical operating ranges the defector had mentioned in passing during his debriefing. By 9:00 a.m. on March 15th, Rothman's contact report was on the desk of Supervisory Special Agent Paul Driscoll, the lead investigator on Red Wave. Driscoll was a 15-year veteran of the Bureau, a former Army Signals Intelligence officer who had worked Soviet counterintelligence since 1952. He understood radio propagation, encryption, and the operational security challenges of running a clandestine transmitter in a hostile environment. He also understood that amateur radio operators, despite their enthusiasm, were unreliable witnesses. Their equipment was often poorly calibrated, their frequency readings approximate, and their interpretations colored by Cold War anxieties and popular culture. But Rothman's report had specifics that caught Driscoll's attention. The frequency was precise to the kilohertz. The time was logged to the minute. The number groups were transcribed in a format consistent with Soviet one-time pad protocols, and Rothman had noted that the signal strength suggested a relatively local transmitter, not a distant broadcast. Driscoll decided to follow up in person. At 4:30 p.m. on March 15th, Driscoll and Special Agent Linda Vasquez arrived at the Rothman residence in Bethesda. They found David in the basement, surrounded by vacuum tubes, coils of wire, and stacks of radio magazines. Driscoll asked to see the logbook. Rothman handed it over, open to the March 14th entry. Driscoll examined the transcription, then asked Rothman to demonstrate his equipment and explain how he had tuned to the frequency. Rothman walked them through the process, showing the calibration marks on his receiver dial, the signal strength meter readings, and the antenna configuration he had been using. Driscoll asked whether Rothman had recorded the transmission. Rothman said no. He did not own a tape recorder. Driscoll asked whether he had heard the transmission again. Rothman said no, but he had been monitoring the same frequency every night since the initial intercept, hoping to catch a repeat. Driscoll told Rothman to continue monitoring and to call immediately if he heard anything similar. Then Driscoll asked a question that would prove critical. He asked whether Rothman had mentioned the intercept to anyone else. Rothman said he had told 2 friends at school, both amateur radio operators, and had asked whether they had heard anything unusual. Driscoll's expression did not change, but Vasquez made a note. The operational security of Red Wave had just been compromised by a teenager's enthusiasm. Driscoll returned to the Washington field office and briefed his supervisor. The decision was made to escalate. If the transmission Rothman had intercepted was genuine, and if it repeated on a predictable schedule, the FBI had a narrow window to identify the transmitter location and the intended recipient. The Bureau's Technical Services Division was tasked with setting up direction-finding equipment in the Bethesda area, and a surveillance team was assigned to monitor Rothman's neighborhood for any unusual activity. Driscoll also requested a review of all State Department, Defense Department, and intelligence community personnel living within a 10-mile radius of Bethesda who had access to classified information and fit the profile of a potential Soviet agent. The list came back with 47 names. One of them was Thomas Kellerman, a 41-year-old translator in the State Department's Bureau of European Affairs. Kellerman's file was unremarkable. Born in Brooklyn in 1922, he had served in the Army during World War II as a German language interpreter, then attended Georgetown University on the GI Bill, earning a degree in Slavic languages. He joined the State Department in 1949 and had worked as a translator and interpreter for 14 years, handling routine diplomatic correspondence and occasionally accompanying mid-level officials to conferences. His security clearance was current. His financial records showed no anomalies. He lived in a modest two-bedroom house in Chevy Chase, 3 miles from Rothman's residence, with his wife and 2 children. There was nothing in the file to suggest espionage. But Driscoll noticed something. Kellerman had been born Tomasz Kellerman, the son of Polish immigrants, and had changed the spelling of his surname in 1950. His mother had returned to Poland in 1947 and had died there in 1953. Kellerman had requested permission to travel to Poland for the funeral, but the request had been denied due to Cold War travel restrictions. Driscoll flagged the file for deeper investigation. On the night of March 21st, exactly 1 week after Rothman's initial intercept, the transmission repeated. Rothman was at his station, monitoring 7.085 MHz as instructed, when the same flat voice began transmitting number groups at 11:52 p.m. This time, Rothman was ready. He had borrowed a reel-to-reel tape recorder from a friend and captured the entire transmission, which lasted 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He called the FBI emergency line immediately. Within 30 minutes, Driscoll and a technical team were at the Rothman house, reviewing the recording and deploying direction-finding antennas. The signal was strong and consistent, suggesting a transmitter within a 5-mile radius. By cross-referencing bearings from 3 mobile DF units positioned around Bethesda, the technical team triangulated the source to a residential area in northwest Chevy Chase. The estimated location was within 2 blocks of Thomas Kellerman's home. Driscoll requested authorization for physical surveillance of Kellerman. The request was approved within hours. By dawn, on March 22nd, a rotating team of FBI agents had established observation posts covering Kellerman's house, his route to work, and his known associates. The surveillance was discreet but comprehensive. Agents photographed everyone who entered or left the residence, logged vehicle movements, and monitored Kellerman's daily routine. For 3 days, nothing unusual occurred. Kellerman left for work at the State Department each morning at 7:45 a.m., returned home at 6:15 p.m., and spent his evenings with his family. He made no unexplained trips, no suspicious contacts, no deviations from a predictable suburban routine. Driscoll began to wonder whether the triangulation had been inaccurate or whether Kellerman was simply a geographic coincidence. Then, on the evening of March 25th, Kellerman broke pattern. At 9:30 p.m., he told his wife he was going to the drugstore to pick up a prescription. He drove his Chevrolet sedan east on Connecticut Avenue, then turned onto a side street and parked near a wooded area adjacent to Rock Creek Park. Surveillance agents watched as Kellerman exited the vehicle, walked into the trees, and disappeared from view. 2 agents followed on foot, maintaining distance. They observed Kellerman stop at a large oak tree, kneel as if tying his shoe, and retrieve something from a hollow at the base of the trunk. The object was small, wrapped in plastic. Kellerman pocketed it, returned to his car, and drove home. The entire excursion lasted 22 minutes. The agents radioed Driscoll, who immediately ordered the surveillance team to mark the tree location and prepare for a dead drop recovery operation. At 2:20 a.m. on March 26th, FBI technical specialists entered the wooded area and examined the oak tree. They found traces of recent disturbance in the hollow and recovered a second plastic-wrapped package that had been placed there after Kellerman's visit. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a coded message and a set of instructions in Russian. The message was photographed and sent to the FBI's cryptanalysis section. The instructions referenced a radio frequency, a transmission schedule, and a recognition protocol. The frequency listed was 7.085 megahertz. The schedule matched the timing of the transmissions Rothman had intercepted. The recognition protocol involved a specific sequence of number groups that would confirm the message had been received and understood. The FBI now had physical evidence linking Kellerman to a Soviet espionage operation. The decision was made to let the operation continue under controlled conditions while building a prosecutable case. The FBI wanted to identify Kellerman's handler, map the full extent of the network, and determine what classified information had been compromised. Surveillance was intensified. Kellerman's office at the State Department was subjected to a covert search, revealing that he had access to diplomatic cables, translation work on sensitive negotiations, and advance copies of policy documents related to arms control and European affairs. A review of his work product over the previous 18 months showed that he had handled materials related to U.S. negotiating positions on the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, NATO force deployments, and confidential communications with West German officials. The potential damage was significant. On the night of April 4th, the number station transmitted again. This time, FBI cryptanalysts were prepared. Using the recovered instructions and a partial one-time pad key found in Kellerman's desk during the covert search, they were able to decrypt portions of the message. It contained a request for specific information about an upcoming diplomatic meeting and instructions for the next dead drop location. The FBI now faced a choice. They could arrest Kellerman immediately, securing a conviction based on the physical evidence and surveillance logs, or they could allow the operation to proceed, hoping to identify and apprehend his handler during the next exchange. Driscoll argued for patience. His superiors, concerned about the risk of further classified leaks and the political fallout if the operation were exposed prematurely, overruled him. The decision was made to move on April 9th. At 6 a.m. on April 9th, 1963, FBI agents executed a search warrant at Kellerman's residence. Kellerman was arrested without incident as he prepared to leave for work. His wife and children were escorted to a separate room while agents searched the house. They found a shortwave radio receiver hidden in the basement, a notebook containing encrypted notes, a second one-time pad concealed in a hollowed-out book, and a small amount of U.S. currency in denominations consistent with KGB operational funding. Kellerman was read his rights and transported to the Washington field office for interrogation. He invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer questions. A parallel search of his State Department office yielded copies of classified documents that had been photographed and prepared for transmission, though the FBI found no evidence that Kellerman had yet passed them to his handler. The arrest triggered a coordinated counterintelligence response. The FBI issued alerts to all intelligence and law enforcement agencies, warning of a potential Soviet network operating in the Washington area. The CIA launched an internal review to determine whether any of its personnel had been compromised. The State Department initiated a damage assessment to catalog the classified information Kellerman had accessed and estimate the intelligence value to the Soviets. The number station went silent after April 4th and never transmitted again on that frequency, suggesting that the KGB had detected the FBI's interest and shut down the operation. Kellerman's handler was never identified. No other members of the network were apprehended. Kellerman was indicted on April 23, 1963, on charges of espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and unauthorized possession of classified documents. His trial began in federal court in Washington on September 16, 1963, and lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the physical evidence recovered from the dead drop and Kellerman's home, the surveillance logs documenting his movements, and testimony from FBI agents and cryptanalysts. The defense argued that Kellerman had been entrapped, that the evidence had been planted, and that the FBI's investigation had violated his constitutional rights. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Kellerman was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He served 19 years before being released on parole in 1982. He died in 1991, never having publicly discussed his espionage activities or his motivations. David Rothman's role in the case was classified for more than 2 decades. The FBI debriefed him extensively in the weeks following Kellerman's arrest, instructing him not to discuss the intercept or the investigation with anyone, including his family. Rothman complied. He continued to operate his amateur radio station, earned a degree in electrical engineering, and eventually worked as a telecommunications engineer for a defense contractor. In 1985, after portions of the Kellerman case were declassified, a Washington Post reporter tracked Rothman down and interviewed him about the intercept. Rothman described the experience as surreal, noting that he had simply been doing what any responsible amateur operator would do when encountering suspicious activity on the airwaves. He expressed no regret, but admitted that the experience had made him more cautious about what he logged in his notebooks and whom he told about unusual signals. The Kellerman case revealed several critical vulnerabilities in U.S. counterintelligence operations during the early 1960s. First, it demonstrated that the Soviets were willing to use relatively low-tech methods, such as shortwave numbers, stations, and dead drops, to communicate with agents in high-value positions, relying on the assumption that such methods would be overlooked in an era increasingly focused on sophisticated electronic surveillance. Second, it exposed gaps in the security clearance process, particularly the failure to adequately assess the psychological and ideological vulnerabilities of individuals with access to classified information. Kellerman's motivations were never fully established, but investigators believed he had been recruited during a 1956 trip to Vienna, possibly through an approach that exploited his resentment over being denied permission to attend his mother's funeral in Poland. Third, the case highlighted the value of open-source intelligence and the role of civilian observers in counterintelligence. Rothman's intercept, dismissed initially as a probable false alarm, proved to be the critical break in an investigation that had stalled for lack of leads. The FBI's handling of the case also raised questions that were debated internally for years. The decision to arrest Kellerman before identifying his handler meant that the broader network, if it existed, was never dismantled. Some within the Bureau argued that the operation should have been allowed to continue under surveillance, accepting the risk of additional leaks in exchange for the possibility of rolling up the entire KGB apparatus in the Washington area. Others countered that the political and security risks were too great, particularly given the sensitivity of the information Kellerman had accessed and the potential for a public scandal if the operation were exposed before arrests were made. The debate was never fully resolved, but the Kellerman case became a reference point in FBI training on the trade-offs between operational security and investigative ambition. Declassified documents released in the 1990s and 2000s provided additional context. KGB files obtained after the collapse of the Soviet Union confirmed that Kellerman, codenamed Translator, had been an active agent from 1957 to 1963 and had provided intelligence on U.S. diplomatic strategy, NATO planning, and arms control negotiations. The files indicated that Kellerman's handler, identified only by the code name Victor, had been a deep-cover illegal operating in the United States under a false identity. Victor was never apprehended and is believed to have exfiltrated to the Soviet Union in late April 1963, shortly after Kellerman's arrest. The KGB assessed the loss of translator as a significant but not catastrophic blow, noting that the intelligence he had provided had been valuable but not irreplaceable. The number station used to communicate with Kellerman was dismantled, and the KGB shifted to alternative communication methods for its remaining agents in the Washington area. The role of amateur radio in the case also had lasting implications. The FBI and other intelligence agencies began to take reports from amateur operators more seriously, establishing formal protocols for logging and investigating intercepts of suspicious transmissions. The National Security Agency, which had largely ignored the amateur radio bands as a potential intelligence source, initiated a program to monitor selected frequencies for anomalous activity. The program, codenamed Sky Hook, ran intermittently throughout the 1960s and 1970s, though its effectiveness was limited by the sheer volume of amateur traffic and the difficulty of distinguishing genuine espionage communications from the background noise of hobbyist transmissions, foreign broadcasters, and propagation anomalies. For Rothman, the experience left a complex legacy. In interviews conducted decades later, he expressed pride in having contributed to a successful counterintelligence operation, but also discomfort with the secrecy and the sense that his role had been minimized in official accounts. He noted that the FBI had never formally thanked him, never offered compensation, and never acknowledged his contribution beyond the initial debriefing. He also reflected on the ethical dimensions of his decision to report the intercept, wondering whether he had been right to involve the government in what might have been an innocent anomaly, and whether his actions had contributed to the destruction of Kellerman's life and family. These questions, he said, had no clear answers, but they stayed with him. The Kellerman case also became a cautionary tale about the human cost of espionage. Kellerman's wife, who maintained her husband's innocence until her death in 2003, was ostracized by neighbors and colleagues after the arrest. She struggled to find employment and eventually moved to another state to escape the stigma. Kellerman's children, both minors at the time of the arrest, grew up under the shadow of their father's conviction. One became a social worker and refused to discuss the case publicly. The other, in a 1998 interview, described the experience as devastating, noting that the family had been given no explanation, no support, and no opportunity to understand what had happened or why. The interview prompted a brief public debate about the treatment of families of convicted spies, but no policy changes resulted. In the end, the case of the teenage ham radio operator and the State Department translator illuminates the intersection of technology, human frailty, and institutional power during the Cold War. It shows how a moment of curiosity and civic responsibility could unravel a covert operation, how a seemingly minor lapse in operational security could expose a years-long espionage effort, and how the machinery of counterintelligence, once set in motion, could grind through lives with procedural efficiency and moral ambiguity. It also reveals the fragility of the systems designed to protect national security, systems that depended not only on sophisticated surveillance and cryptanalysis, but also on the vigilance of ordinary citizens who happened to be in the right place, with the right skills, at the right time. What remains unknown is whether Kellerman acted alone or was part of a larger network that successfully evaded detection. Declassified files suggest the possibility of at least 2 other agents operating in the Washington area during the same period, but their identities were never confirmed. The question of what information Kellerman passed to the Soviets and what impact it had on U.S. policy and Cold War dynamics is similarly unresolved. The damage assessment conducted by the State Department in 1963 remains partially classified, and the full scope of the compromise may never be known. What is clear is that the case demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of Cold War counterintelligence, the unpredictable role of chance and individual initiative in espionage, and the enduring tension between security and transparency in a democratic society operating under existential threat. The story of David Rothman and Thomas Kellerman is ultimately a story about listening. Rothman listened to the airwaves and heard something that did not belong. The FBI listened to Rothman and heard a lead worth pursuing. Kellerman listened to a recruitment pitch and heard an opportunity or a compulsion that led him to betray his country. And decades later, historians and analysts listen to the declassified fragments of the case and hear echoes of a conflict fought not only with missiles and armies, but with codes, dead drops, and the quiet decisions made by individuals in basements and offices and wooded parks. The question that remains is what else was transmitted, received, and acted upon in the shadows of the Cold War that we have not yet learned to hear.